Hey, welcome to The Explainer. I want you to think back for a second. Back to when you were somewhere between 5 and 11 years old. You know, that time of playground politics, learning a ton of new skills, and really trying to figure out who you were. Well, today, we're cracking open a 5-minute study guide to that exact period, middle childhood, to really understand the emotional and social shifts that basically build the foundation for the rest of our lives.
So our guide today has 5 main chapters. First, we're going to tackle the core challenge every single kid faces at this age. Then, we'll dive into how they start building their self-esteem and their mindset. After that, we'll explore the huge, expanding world of friendships, and we'll wrap up with the role of family and how it handles big changes.
All right, let's jump right into Chapter 1. At this age, a kid's main job, psychologically speaking, is to answer one huge question. Am I capable? Can I do this? It's all about this powerful drive to feel competent. And this slide? This is the heart of it. The psychologist Erik Erikson called this stage industry versus inferiority. So think of industry as that awesome feeling of pride a kid gets from finally mastering something new. You know, like riding a bike or nailing a math problem or making a new friend. But on the flip side, if they keep running into failure without any support, they can start to feel a deep sense of inferiority. And this internal tug-of-war is really what starts to shape how they see themselves in the world.
So this whole internal battle for competence, it directly feeds into how kids start to build their identity, which, leads us perfectly into our next chapter.
Which is Chapter 2, where we get into that massive question, who am I? And we explore the beginning of self-esteem.
Listen to this quote. It's perfect. It shows you the brand new level of complexity in how a kid thinks about themselves. It's not just I'm a good kid anymore. Suddenly, it's this really nuanced scorecard of all their different skills. They're constantly comparing themselves to other kids, and that creates a way more detailed and sometimes kind of conflicting picture of who they are.
And that detailed self-portrait, that's what we call self-concept. But self-esteem, that's the next layer. So if self-concept is the list of facts, I'm good at reading, not so great at math, then self-esteem is the feeling about that list. It's the judgment call we make on the person we see in the mirror.
So where do all these feelings come from? Well, as you can see here, kids are looking for clues absolutely everywhere. They look to their friends to figure out if they're popular or good at sports. They look to their teachers and parents for feedback on schoolwork. And the research is super clear on one thing. A parenting style that is both warm and firm, what's known as authoritative, is consistently linked to kids developing higher, healthier self-esteem.
Okay, on to Chapter 3. Let's talk about the engine inside a child's head that pretty much determines whether they push through a challenge or just give up, and that's their mindset.
This slide breaks down the two completely different paths a kid's thinking can take. Over on the left, you've got a growth mindset, which is the belief that you can get better at things. For these kids, failure isn't some final verdict. It's just feedback that says, okay, try harder next time. But on the right, you have a fixed mindset, which is the belief that your ability is just set in stone. So failure feels like a personal judgment, and they might start to avoid challenges altogether just to protect their ego. The real takeaway here is that the mindset itself is what drives their behavior.
And here's a perfect example of how adults can have a huge impact on which mindset a child develops. When you praise the process, saying something like, wow, you worked so hard and figured it out, you're encouraging a growth mindset. You're telling the child that their effort is what counts. But when you praise the person, saying you're so smart, you can actually, accidentally, promote a fixed mindset. It can make a kid afraid to try things where they might not look smart.
All right, time to move from the inner world to the outer world in Chapter 4. Because during middle childhood, the social universe of friends and classmates just explodes and becomes incredibly powerful.
So, what makes a kid popular at this age? Well, the research points to a pretty clear set of traits. Kids who are socially accepted are often what we call prosocial, which is just a fancy way of saying they're helpful, cooperative, and kind. They're usually not very aggressive, they tend to have a good sense of humor, and they're not afraid to step up and be a leader.
Now on the flip side of that, peer rejection is a tough reality, and it usually shows up in one of two ways. You have the rejected aggressive kid who's often impulsive and gets into a lot of conflicts, and then you have the rejected withdrawn kid who's more passive, really socially anxious, and just tends to back away from social situations. Understanding these two types is so key to understanding social struggles.
Okay, for our final chapter, let's turn to the anchor of a child's world, their family. And specifically, the impact of a massive life event like divorce.
To really get a handle on the family's role, we have to look at one of the biggest curveballs a family can face. So let's start with some context. Here in North America, about a third of all first marriages end in divorce.
Now think about what that means for kids. It translates to this staggering number. Roughly half of all children will experience their parents' divorce before they even turn 18. This isn't some rare thing. For millions of kids, it's a defining part of growing up.
So what actually happens? Well, the research shows that on average, children of divorce might face more challenges. You know, things like trouble in school, acting out, or feeling more anxious or depressed. But, and this is a really, really big but, these effects are almost always strongest in that first year, right after the split. The data overwhelmingly shows that the vast majority of kids are incredibly resilient, they adapt, and they grow up to be well-adjusted adults. The disruption is real, for sure, but it is not a life sentence.
And so we end our little study guide here, right back where we started. We've seen how a child's world is built on feeling competent, on believing in themselves, on their friendships, and on their family. So the final question to leave you with is this. Knowing all this, what's the most powerful thing an adult can do to help build that sense of industry? That confident voice that says, I can do it, in the face of all these challenges. That's really something to think about.